Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and what follows is an excerpted clip from one of my longer webinars. So what I've decided is that sometimes when people ask really interesting questions, I will pull out that particular part of a webinar and make it available to you as a short clip so that if you don't have time to watch a 1-hour webinar, you can at least watch and listen to the brief exchanges that I usually have with people who attend my webinars. So here is one such clip from a recent webinar. I hope you enjoy it. I think about pedagogy in general, but literature pedagogy in particular is obviously inflected through my politics and through what I consider a humanistic education ought to do or ought to be about. So if you keep that in mind, that would give you the first principle of literature pedagogy, that it is what you want the outcomes to be, right? Because that will then decide your philosophy, but also your strategies, your in-class activities, what you prefer to teach. So let's assume that, like me, you believe that literature cannot just be taught simply that this is what a text means, but that it has a larger function, and that is that a good education in literature can enable our students to think about the text more reflectively, but to also go out and use that knowledge to see how the world works, what is just in it, what is unjust in it, and then try to make a difference in that work. Now, that mode of teaching is what we consider an ameliorative mode of teaching, a mode of teaching that presupposes that study of literature can make us into better people and then can make us into people who want to go and change the world, make it better. Now, if you disagree with that, obviously, then your approach will be different. So there are people, very powerful scholars, who will tell you that's not your job as a literature professor. You're not there to teach your students how to be responsible global citizens. Your job is to teach the texts assigned in your course and enable your students to read them critically. And if you give them a critical consciousness, they will eventually become political, right? So they have a point. There are competing schools of thought. I will mostly dwell on how my own pedagogy is shaped, why, and how do I try to accomplish it, right? And then anything that you want to add to it or want to, add your own experiences of learning, but also if you have taught, your experiences of teaching will be very helpful in making this, this conversation even more enriching. So technically, the way I was trained, my mentors and professors that I studied with were all critical scholars of critical pedagogy. And what I mean is that these are the people who had read their Paulo Freire and Henry Giroux and all the John Dewey even. These were the people who believed that a humanistic education, if delivered correctly or in a certain way, can go beyond just teaching the value of the text or the meaning of the text, but can also encourage our students to develop critical skills, of course, but also to develop more compassionate, ethical selves, the kind of selves that are sensitive to cultural differences, the kind of selves that are sensitive to the inequalities that exist in the world and then actually want to go and do something about it. And this doesn't apply to just literature majors. This applies to anyone who walks into our class. So that means that my belief system and the belief system of my mentors and our philosophy was that a literary education is more than just knowing what Conrad says or what Shakespeare means. It's more than that, because it encourages that in the process of learning the literary text, we should also encourage our students to think the world differently, right? And then try to change it as they go out and do their work in the world. Now, that is what we call an ameliorative practice, a practice that believes that education ought to give more than just the skills, right? And that a humanistic education absolutely must focus on more than just giving our students technical skills to read literature, reproduce answers, and write about it, but develop deeper modes of thinking and praxis, right? Now, how do we accomplish it? How do we do it? That differs widely between which practices we focus on. What do we focus on? And I apologize. I'm using my own self as a reference, right? But the reason is that I can only talk about this in terms of a self-reference because I have, 20 years of teaching experience, but 20 years of consciously teaching in a certain specific way, right? In a way in which I try to make sure that what I do in my classroom has implications outside the classroom. Now, in my classes, I always use two questions to frame my course. And the questions are, I encourage my students to do two things. When they read a novel or a short story, I ask them, ask yourself, why do I think about this book or this? Why do I think like this? If I'm reading a story and certain thoughts about characters or story are coming to mind, I need to ask myself, why do I think about it like that? And then if a story makes me feel a certain way, I need to ask myself, why do I feel the way I feel, right? So if they start answering these two questions, what it covers is the entire realm of human experience, reason, and the aesthetics, the feelings, right? And the idea is that would help them, that would encourage them to question their own assumptions about people, right? For example, let's say you are reading a sign, right? Right now in Pakistan, those of you who are joining me from Pakistan, every year when the Women's Month comes along, the Women's March becomes a huge issue, right? So some men respond to it differently, others respond to it differently. So in personal terms, if you look at women marching in the street and you're uncomfortable with it, that's not a natural position, right? So you ask yourself, why do I feel like this? What is it about this act that troubles me? And that will enable you to question your own assumptions, to question your own prejudices, right? So these are the two questions that I frame my teaching with, right? And then what informs my teaching is the people I have interacted with, people I have read, people who have explained how to do a kind of literary practice and pedagogy that is beyond the text, that goes beyond the text, and tries to mobilize literature to teach not one single way of living, no, but to teach some kind of compassionate form of living, a kind of life in which we don't just judge people, right? We try to figure out how to understand our others without expecting them to be like us. And then to feel as human beings, what are our responsibilities to each other and what are our obligations to each other? So that is what grounds my pedagogy, regardless of whether I'm teaching a graduate class or an undergraduate class. And that, if you sum it up, is one form of what we call critical pedagogy. Quick question. If I would like to teach with the intention of making the world a better place, how do I do so without pushing my interpretation of text onto my own students? That's a very good question. So here is the deal. We all have politics, right? And we always are interpellated by our political positions, right? Now, I teach in Texas. Not all my students are liberal, progressive students. But I'm a leftist, right? I believe in certain modes of thinking. Now, some people do it in a very aggressive manner, right? That totally defies the purpose of that kind of critical pedagogy, because they just like my point of view is the only right point of view and yours is not. No. So you approach it with humility. What I do in my classes very openly is I tell my students, look, I am left of any left that you can imagine, but you don't have to be like me to do well in this class. I will respect your opinions. If you want to debate them, I will debate them with you. But at the end of the day, the purpose of the course isn't for you to think like me. I will try to do what I deem is good for us as human beings and as the world. You have the absolute right to disagree with me, right? In the process of disagreeing with each other, we'll be respectful to each other. And that always works. Remember, any act of transformation in a classroom must start with a certain degree of humility. You cannot have hard positions, and you cannot absolutely say it's my way or the highway. And so a certain degree of humility and openness always helps, and the patience to hear your students out. The idea is you're trying to encourage them to think differently. The only way you can encourage them to think differently is if you encourage them and if you let them know that their thoughts will be respected and they will not be derided or made fun of, right? That's the first question. But the kind of pedagogy that one of my colleagues does, one of the leading scholars of critical pedagogy is Mark Bracker. He's my former colleague. And I think his approach is more scientific than mine. And for example, he has studied people who have done research on the brain, on consciousness, how does our consciousness work, everything else. I have very extensive recorded lectures on his work. And what he does in his class is he has some leading questions. Let's say he's teaching a novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So the leading questions would usually be, okay, this is what is happening to a slave here. What does it make you feel? Right? Or this enslaved woman is being treated like this. Can you share your feelings about it? Right? So when I was teaching with him, sometimes we will have students who will share our classes, right? And I'll ask them, I was like, how is your class going with Dr. Bracker? And they would it's like by second week, we know what kind of an answer he wants from us. Because his idea is that you only alter people's mental schemas through repetition, right? And so I was like, so what do you guys do? And it's like when he asks us, oh, this slave is being tortured, what does it make you feel? And obviously we tell him, oh my God, this makes me feel bad and it's terrible and unjust, right? So I went to Mark and I said, Mark, your students are telling me that they just invent orders. And he laughed at me and he's like, that is the point, right? He said, our mental schemas are built in a way that they encourage us to perform a certain identity, right? We perform an identity because of them. So he said, in my classroom for one semester, 40 minutes every other week, if they perform a compassionate, empathetic identity, right? That performance is actually altering their mental schemas because they are doing something which they probably have never done before, right? If let's say it's a student who's a racist, but to get an A in the class for one semester, he or she performs an identity that is not racist, but that is sympathetic to the plight of the others. He said, if done repeatedly in a course, the scientific research tells me that the mental schemas of that student would shift because performing an empathetic identity towards others has now become part of his lived performative experience. And that made absolute sense to me, right? Now, I don't do it like that. I'm not that technical about it, right? But I do make sure that my students know that their opinions will be respected, unless they end up being racist or sexist opinions or any homophobic, then I have to correct them on that, right? Because that is hurtful to my students who might be women or gay or lesbians in my class, so I have to protect them. But other than that, differences of political opinion absolutely doesn't matter. It actually encourages better discussions in a class. But you come to it from a point of humility, and that has always worked for me. Okay. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this brief clip. If you are interested in the longer version, the link will be in the description and you can watch the whole webinar. Thank you so much for your support. And as always, if you have any questions, any concerns, you can always post them in the comments and I'll be happy to respond to them. If you have a moment and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so now so that you get timely notifications of whatever is happening on this channel. Thank you for your support. Stay safe, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.